How many of you are the coach that you played for? Everything that you do exactly as they did it, because while you were there with them, they had such a profound impact on you that when you left, you decided you were bound and determined to change the world. Or how many of you are your first boss? You slid your feet really conveniently and comfortably into their shoes, and you never thought, what if it rubs blisters? Or what if I can't keep them on? You didn't really think too much about fit, but of course they didn't because they weren't your shoes. Or how about maybe you're the guy who is the guy you're currently working for or with, and maybe this will hit coaches of female sports a little bit. Maybe you're coaching a women's team and the guy across the hall who's coaching the men's team is getting it done, and he's very well respected and he's very relevant, and you yearn for a little bit of that. Maybe you're your hero. Maybe you're a poor man's Brad Stevens or a Steve Kerr wannabe, or maybe you're slipping on the Bill Belichick hoodie. Why is it that we so conveniently fold and cram ourselves into other people's skin? I think the truth of that is probably because it's a whole lot easier than figuring out who we really are. Because internal digging is hard, and soul excavation is probably the most difficult work that any of us will ever do. I heard a story one time about a little boy named John, and he rode his bike up to the border, and he had 2 sacks on his shoulder, each one filled with sand, and he got to the border gate, and the border patrol said, "Son, what is in that sack?" And John said, "Well, it's sand." And he said, "We'll see about that." And so the border patrol took the sack off and cut it open and checked it out, and sure enough, it was sand. And so he sealed it back up and put it on his shoulder and sent him on his way. And the next week, John rode up to the border patrol again. He stopped at the gate, and he had 2 sacks on his shoulders, and the border patrol said, "What's in those sacks?" And he said, "Sand." And he said, "Absolutely not. You're going to have to give those to me." And so they gave both the sacks to the border patrol. They cut them open, and this time they sent them through an extensive x-ray machine, and they did everything that they could to test them, and they said, "Man, it is sand." And so they sealed them up, put them back on his shoulders, and this happened every single week, time and time and time again. And eventually, the border patrol officer retired, and he's sitting one day in a bar, and in walks John. It's been years down the road, and he says, "John, come here, son. Come here, son. I want to buy you a beer." And so John goes up to the bar and sits down by him. And the patrol officer says, "I want you to know that I've retired, and I've been out of the business for a while, but I have great pride in my law enforcement career. And there's one thing that has haunted me since my retirement. And if you could just answer this question for me, then I could have some peace when I go into my retirement. I would feel like I had done my due diligence and done my job. All those years you were riding up to the Border Patrol, I know that you were smuggling something. And John, I have to know, what were you smuggling?" John took a sip of his beer and said, "Bicycles." Thank you. Some of you were paying attention. That's the whole point. What if, as we diligently strive to get this right, and we tie ourselves and our intentions so sincerely to solving the puzzle, what if we look so hard at trying to do it that we find out we missed the most important thing? What if the most important thing is not the players that we acquire? What if the most important thing is not the strategy that we employ? What if the most important thing is not the system or the drills that we frame, the things that we teach? As coaches, we are often notorious tellers and doers. We are world class at telling people what to do, and not so much at searching and asking, especially when that arrow is bent back toward us. Think about it. Many times we know the players who we coach better than we know ourselves. And it's sometimes really, really hard to wrap our head around what it looks like when we shine that light back inside. Steven Spielberg made a movie a couple of years ago called Lincoln, and in it there's a very poignant scene where there's an intimate conversation and somewhat of a debate between the chairman of the House Means and Ways Committee and President Lincoln. And the chairman says to him, "You have to tie yourself to your moral compass. You have to unambiguously chase your true north." And he's imploring to the president. And the president says to him, "When I stand in the field and hold my compass, it certainly tells me true north." but it does not give me any indication about the swamps and the deserts and the chasms along the way. And if in my pursuit of that goal, I end up stuck in a swamp, what good to me is true north? Self-awareness is how we navigate. As coaches, day in and day out, hour by hour almost, what we are asked to do repeatedly is decide. Decide, 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 decide. Making decisions is arguably the most challenging and most important thing that we do. And without self-awareness, how do we ever make good decisions? If we're not self-aware, then the distractions and the noises get us so far off course that we can't even imagine how we could possibly get back to true north. And to be real honest, sometimes we can't even remember why we wanted to be there in the first place. So how do you do this thing? How do you become self-aware? Well, to be quite frank, I'm not really sure I have any idea. I do, however, have a card that you're going to be, if you haven't received it yet, it will be handed out to you. And what it is a list of about 10 questions that hopefully will serve as a kickstart, that will open a vein and get you started digging. The journey, I don't think, is the same for every one of us. It is probably every bit as unique as the final destination. I don't think how we get there really matters so much, but getting there and gaining the knowledge is incredibly important, because what we find when we know ourselves, that thing has tentacles that wrap around and shape the way we coach and ultimately impact the way that we live. Happy digging. Thank you.